It all kicked off with a jaw-dropping accusation. Jasmine Crockett was reportedly interfering with the national judiciary and was subsequently banned for 5 years. But when she faced off with Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, she turned the whole situation upside down with just one question and an undercover $2.7 million secret lying deep within the establishment. In a matter of hours, his authority was stripped away, and his reputation shattered. The whole system hit a wall. So, what exactly did Jasmine say to bring a Supreme Court justice down a notch? Stick around, this story deserves your full attention. That morning in Washington, D.C., the winds were fierce enough to cut through metal. At 6:13 a.m. sharp, Jasmine's phone buzzed with a message that felt more like a warning than a legal notice. She had to appear before the D.C. Federal Court of Appeals at 9 a.m. No backstory, no lawyer notified, and no previous cases mentioned, just a cold urgency wrapped in formal language. The accusation? A vague claim of misusing influence to meddle with federal judicial processes. But those paying close attention sensed there was more to it. Just 3 days earlier, she had stood in a Senate oversight hearing and blasted the federal judiciary for protecting itself while ordinary folks dealt with the fallout from its decisions. She hadn't named any judges, but her words hit hard, like a missile. It seemed like the establishment was striking back in the most blatant way possible. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere grew even colder, not from the AC, but from the palpable tension. The gallery was filled with journalists, congressional aides, and a surprising number of federal court watchers, all feeling that something big was about to go down. Then, with a creak, the chamber doors opened, and the room fell silent. Brett Kavanaugh stepped in, not as a visitor or dignitary, but in his role as the hearing's presiding justice. His presence was not just out of the ordinary, it was downright inappropriate, a clear breach of custom and ethics. As a sitting Supreme Court justice, he had no procedural role in this situation, yet he walked in like he owned the place, exuding the calm of someone who knows how to bend the rules. His gaze swept across the courtroom, landing squarely on Jasmine. Cameras clicked simultaneously, breaths were held. What should have been a straightforward legal hearing had transformed into a political spectacle, masked in judicial robes. As he took his seat at the bench, it was clear this wasn't about law, it was a theatrical display set to dismantle. Before the gavel even struck, the attack began. Jasmine's lawyer, a veteran constitutional attorney with 2 decades under his belt, stood to speak but barely made it through his introduction. Kavanaugh raised a hand, cutting him off with a tone sharp enough to cut glass, filled with disdain. "We don't need prepared defenses here," he declared, his words whipping through the room like a lash. This wasn't a legal objection, it was a calculated effort to silence him. The cameras caught it all, along with the observers in the room. Then came the shift. Kavanaugh slowly turned his gaze on Jasmine, not as a judge addressing a citizen, but as a man confronting a threat to his power. "You," he said, his voice flat and almost amused by her defiance, "are a volatile mix, political ambition, questionable morals, and misplaced confidence." Each of those words landed like punches, designed to hurt rather than debate. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the seasoned court reporters looked taken aback. This wasn't judicial language, it felt like a personal attack disguised as legal discourse. Jasmine held her ground. She sat tall, her breathing even, but her eyes sparked with the smoldering anger of someone who's faced this kind of stuff before, from men who weren't afraid of her mistakes, but terrified of her refusal to back down. She didn't offer a defense or plead for mercy. Her silence didn't mean surrender, it was defiance. It said, "You don't get to define me here." Kavanaugh leaned back a bit, his voice dropping to a slower, more venomous tone. "People like you shouldn't be near Congress or any real centers of power." The word "you" carried a heavy significance. It wasn't just about the case or the legalities, it was about who Jasmine was, a black woman who was outspoken, fearless, and unyielding in her resistance to privilege. His remarks weren't merely a judgment, they were a stark warning to anyone watching. Cross this system, and it will crush you. His robe was a shield, his bench a throne, and his words a verdict served without a trial. Before Jasmine or her legal team could even respond, Kavanaugh picked up a document from the folder in front of him and signed it with a sense of finality, his eyes glued to the paper. "This court hereby imposes a 5-year suspension from all governmental duties," he stated, his tone flat, almost disinterested, effective immediately. "You are also barred from running for any public office during this time." He didn't cite any precedent, provide any reasoning, or seek deliberation. He just didn't care. In less than 20 minutes, a sitting congresswoman was stripped of her position by a judge who shouldn't have even been there, without evidence, due process, or a hint of regret. Outside, the headlines were brewing like storm clouds. Kavanaugh silences Crockett, justice or a power grab? Courtroom clash sparks outrage, no defense allowed. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the end of a hearing. It was the sound of democracy bending on live television for millions to witness. Jasmine, though knocked down, remained unmoved. Her body was still, but her presence shook the courtroom's foundations more than any gavel ever could. The room may have moved on, but Jasmine hadn't, not in her thoughts, memories, or in her very essence. She sat up straight, jaw tight, her spine straight as steel, as the courtroom settled into its formal hush. But inside, the insults thrown her way just moments before echoed louder than any gavel: low morals, unwarranted confidence. She'd heard that tone before, not in courtrooms, but on street corners, in school corridors, in whispers, even over police radios. They never explicitly said race, but it hung in the air with every word. As Kavanaugh's voice faded, another one rose in her mind, the shout of a white police officer beneath a street lamp in Houston. She was 17, heading home from a debate competition, hoodie pulled up, hands in her pockets. He stopped her for suspicious behavior. When she locked eyes with him, something inside him seemed to shatter. "Don't look at me like you have rights," he hissed, shoving her face first onto the pavement. Her cheek bled on the concrete as his knee pressed her down. She felt caught between fear and anger, but she didn't cry. Instead, she counted the cracks in the street, memorizing injustice one fracture at a time. It wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel unwelcome, but it was the first time she understood that belonging had little to do with justice and everything to do with power. That moment became the bedrock for something much bigger. It carried her through college, where professors mistook her silence for ignorance until she raised her hand and took apart their arguments with razor-sharp precision. But the hardest lessons came later. In her first year of law school, Jasmine almost faced expulsion after an emotional outburst in a constitutional law class discussing the Trayvon Martin case. She stood up, her voice trembling with barely contained fury, and declared, "You don't get to treat Black Death like a thought experiment." The professor told her to leave. She did, but returned hours later, not to apologize but to stand her ground. In a quiet corner of the campus library, she studied civil rights cases under dim lights until dawn. No one noticed her, no one applauded, but that night she resolved to master the very system that had once tried to erase her. Jasmine picked public defense not because it was glamorous, but because it brought her face to face with the very cruelty she had experienced herself. She worked with clients who struggled with English, had no money for bail, and were often alone in the world. There were young black boys charged as adults and immigrant women too frightened to even say their names. She listened to them when no one else would, took on cases that others deemed lost causes, and through her tireless preparation and a fierce spirit born in Houston, she turned those cases into wins. Jasmine won 9 civil rights cases in a row, not because the system was kind to her, but because she refused to back down. Her successes made her a target, labeled as too emotional, too loud, too radical. Yet Jasmine understood that what they called too much was often just enough to ignite real change. Now, in a courtroom stacked against her, facing a man who answered to no one about his past, a man whose confirmation hearings silenced those who dared to speak, Jasmine stayed silent. Her gaze didn't drop. Her silence was more powerful than words, fueled by something deep inside her. If I don't stand up now, how many voices will never get the chance to be heard? As she walked out of the courtroom, the system that had humiliated her made a critical misstep. It forgot that silence doesn't mean giving up. Jasmine moved through the courthouse hallway like a ghost, the weight of injustice heavy on her. Behind her, the courtroom noise echoed with verdicts disguised as revenge. Ahead, a swarm of cameras and whispers waited, ready for a quote, a breakdown, anything that would suggest she had lost. But just before she could step down the marble stairs, a voice, not spoken, but felt, shifted the narrative. From the edge of the hallway, partly hidden in the shadows of a bronze statue of justice, stood Senator Allen Rivers. He didn't wave or call out, he just stepped forward, his eyes carrying the weight of scars from years of navigating betrayal. With a smooth motion, he brushed past her, slipping a thin brown leather envelope into her hand. It felt heavier than it appeared, as if it contained not just papers but significant consequences. He disappeared into a private elevator before anyone noticed the handoff. Jasmine didn't stop or say a word, she kept moving, through the chaos, into the solid silence of her car waiting outside. Only when the doors closed, blocking the noise from the world, did she open the envelope. Its contents hit her like a second trial, this one without a judge. Inside were neatly folded pages, some old and yellowing, others crisp and urgent. At the top of the first page was a Department of Justice letterhead marked, "Confidential Internal Review Only." Her fingers shook as she read a detailed account of undeclared luxury gifts, private jet flights, and behind-the-scenes meetings connected to Justice Brett Kavanaugh. There were itemized logs of stays at international resorts, hospitality receipts under fake names, and handwritten notes linking them to political lobbyists using tax-exempt fronts. She flipped to the next page and froze. A record of a wire transfer jumped out. $2.7 million, dated September 2016, funneled through a Delaware nonprofit to a law firm that specialized in hush settlements. The memo line simply stated special circumstance resolution. An attached memo plainly mentioned a sexual misconduct claim that had been settled out of court, sealed by a non-disclosure agreement, though Kavanaugh's legal team had known about it during his vetting process. Though they kept her name under wraps, the timeline was unmistakable. This wasn't just gossip or speculation, it was a hidden truth, tucked away behind privilege and wiped clean from official records. The following documents laid out emails, dates, names, and places that connected Kavanaugh to political funders and lobbyists, including a private getaway just 2 weeks before he made a favorable decision on a billion-dollar lawsuit that involved one of those firms. The proof was solid, no doubts, no guessing. Jasmine leaned back, the envelope resting in her lap like a ticking bomb. Her heart raced, not from fear but from a newfound clarity. What started as a setup against her had turned into a journey to the rotten heart of a system shrouded in robes. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a faint, bitter smile, because she got it. This was no longer about vindicating herself. It was about bringing the truth to light behind those robes. When Jasmine stepped back into the courtroom, she felt different, no longer the one on trial, even if they didn't realize it yet. The walls seemed to close in, as if the very building was conspiring against her. Eyes from the gallery cut through her like daggers, not out of intrigue, but expectation. Everyone was waiting to see how a woman publicly shamed would confront the man who tried to bury her. Kavanaugh sat motionless on the bench, his face a mask, but his fingers drummed nervously on the armrest, a quiet hint of his discomfort. Jasmine's heels echoed on the floor, each step a silent countdown. Rising from her chair, she carried the calm of someone who's faced hellfire. The room had no idea she wasn't after justice, she had proof that it was missing. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and controlled, "I ask for a chance to make a final statement defending my name and integrity." The silence that followed crackled with intensity. Reporters paused mid-sentence. Some even stopped typing. The moment felt charged, like a loaded weapon. Kavanaugh took a moment before replying. He focused on the papers in front of him, seemingly searching for shelter in legal language. For a heartbeat, it looked as though he'd deny her request. "This hearing is concluded," he said, his tone flat, more instinct than decision. But outside, the power dynamics were shifting. The livestream's viewer count soared past 4.3 million, with headlines blasting across platforms, "Justice or Vendetta?" Crockett silenced. The stakes had risen beyond procedural issues, it was now political, national, historic. Kavanaugh sensed it. His pause wasn't cautiousness, it was the dawning realization that he was losing control of the narrative. His previously unassailable strength started to feel vulnerable under the scrutiny of unseen observers. Lifting his head, his mouth formed a tight line, trying to maintain authority. "Make it brief," he said, his sharp tone tinged with uncertainty, almost defensive. Jasmine held her ground, neither blinking nor smiling. She nodded slightly, the kind of nod you give before stepping into the unknown, knowing you might not fall. Jasmine stepped up, not as someone on trial but as a witness ready to challenge the system. The air in the room shifted, not because of movement, but due to the weight of the unspoken truth she was about to reveal. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she made her way to the podium, fingers lightly brushing her briefcase, like a musician preparing for a show. Cameras swung her way, every gaze fixed on the woman who had been silenced just days earlier, now standing tall like a sharp blade. She skipped looking at her notes or clearing her throat. With steady determination, she pulled a brown leather envelope from her briefcase. Her breathing was calm, hands firm, as she opened it and unfolded the first document, presenting the Department of Justice seal to the audience, visible to every journalist in the room. "This," she said, her voice cool and clear, "is an internal memo from the Department of Justice outlining undeclared gifts received by Justice Brett Kavanaugh." Not a single person shifted in their seat. Her voice was precise, devoid of emotion, as if the facts were too damaging for any dramatic flair. Private jet flights, luxury resort stays, financial contributions from individuals with active cases before the court. Each word hit hard, like stones sinking into the shallow facade of authority surrounding her. She raised the document high and then placed it on the podium, flipping to the next page with the grace of someone untroubled by the consequences. Her eyes darted across the next sheet. This wasn't just one gift or one meeting. It was a pattern, a web, a relationship between judgment and influence that shouldn't exist. She read off the figures: $114,000 for a private hunting trip, $98,100 for hotel stays, a $14,200 consulting fee linked to a shell company tied to a lobbying group. The room grew tense, like a vice tightening around them. Staffers held their breath, reporters scribbled frantically, and the live stream count shot past 5 million. Jasmine remained unfazed. She flipped to the third page, then the fourth, her voice steady but her eyes blazing quietly with anger as they zeroed in on Kavanaugh. Undisclosed meetings at a Colorado lodge. A $2.7 million payout funneled through a non-profit to silence a 2016 misconduct allegation during his nomination year. She paused, and the silence felt heavy. Her gaze was locked on Kavanaugh, her words now directed at him, not just the paper. "If I get suspended for what I've said into this microphone, tell me, Your Honor, Do you honestly think taking yachts and cash from litigants before you is more ethical? The silence wasn't neutral, it hung over the room like an indictment. The courtroom trembled with tension. No response came from the bench, and not a breath stirred in the press box. For the first time, Brett Kavanaugh confronted a reckoning without a way to respond. But Jasmine wasn't finished. When truth finds a microphone, it doesn't whisper. She shifted slightly, still commanding the room, and nodded to the clerk. The monitor flickered to life, revealing a secret that wasn't meant to be uncovered. The image was striking. Kavanaugh leaning back at a Colorado resort, surrounded by men in high-end hunting gear, holding a glass of scotch. Beside him was Martin Chase, CEO of Agrinova Industries, a company involved in a Supreme Court case Kavanaugh had voted to dismiss. Jasmine let the silence stretch, then delivered her point with precision. This man has a direct financial interest in a ruling Justice Kavanaugh helped bury. This isn't just perception. This is a clear pattern. Without waiting for anyone to say a word, Jasmine tapped on another file on the screen. Suddenly, a young woman's shaky voice filled the room. He told me if I went public, they'd destroy me. I'd lose my job, my reputation. The audio wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. He said it wouldn't be the judge who ruined me, it would be the people protecting him. Jasmine just let the voice play, her silence drawing attention to a truth that had been kept quiet for too long. That's a former legal intern from the Federal Vetting Committee, she stated firmly. In 2016, her initial complaint didn't even get reviewed. She was pushed out and blacklisted from 2 law firms in D.C. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned icy, not in reverence, but in shock. The last line of the recording hit hard like a fresh wound. I didn't stop because I was wrong. I stopped because I was warned. Once the recording ended, the sense of consequence hung in the air. Nobody moved. The words felt like smoke lingering after a blast. It wasn't just proof, it was exposure that seeped into the nation's consciousness. A senior Department of Justice official, who had been quietly seated on the left, stood up without a fuss, closed his folder, and walked out, signaling a decisive moment. His departure wasn't over the top, it was significant, indicating that this was now a legal matter, completely beyond the courtroom's reach. The news cameras shifted focus. Kavanaugh sat there, frozen, his knuckles turning white on the chair, his gaze unfocused, as if he could only see the reckoning that was gathering around him. His robe, which once symbolized authority, suddenly felt out of place, like a costume worn for too long. The facade of invulnerability had shattered in front of millions, and the silence wasn't one of respect, it was a moment of realization. The bench no longer provided shelter, the robe was no longer a barrier, and the man behind them was laid bare. No gavel was struck, no one called for order, and no motion to take a break was made. For the first time, Kavanaugh found himself unable to control what would happen next. His once unquestioned authority had become toxic, something even his colleagues might steer clear of. Jasmine's presence filled the room, not by raising her voice, but with undeniable truth. The atmosphere thickened with accountability that had been long avoided. A murmur spread through the gallery, then among the reporters, followed by the sound of a clerk's earpiece buzzing to life. The Department of Justice, observing everything in real time, acted quickly. A senior spokesperson from the DOJ stepped up to the microphones outside the courthouse, announcing Kavanaugh's suspension from his special supervisory role in all judicial matters, effective immediately. The impact hit like a thunderclap, shattering the illusion of immunity surrounding the man in the robe. The gallery erupted, tension breaking loose. Some gasped, while others closed their eyes, as if they had finally exhaled years of pent-up breath. Jasmine stood there, a quiet intensity that was louder than any applause. A court officer stepped up, reading a statement. By order of judicial review, the 5-year suspension imposed on Representative Jasmine Crockett is vacated and nullified, found to violate procedural safeguards and constitutional fairness. The clerk added almost as an afterthought, the court apologizes for the irregular process. That was about as close to an acknowledgement of guilt as Jasmine was ever going to get. Everyone's gaze shifted to Kavanaugh, but he didn't move. For once, he seemed smaller than the authority of his robe. His hand lay flat on the desk, not defiantly but just resting there. The moment's magic faded. The fear in the room had shifted. Power no longer emanated from the bench, it resonated from Jasmine herself. Kavanaugh was stiff as he pushed his chair back, the wheels scraping loudly against the marble floor. He didn't meet Jasmine's eyes or acknowledge the spectators, pausing to let the moment hang there, thick and palpable. His once sharp gaze lowered in defeat. He walked out quietly, not as a justice but as a man retreating from the weight of truth. The door clicked shut, marking the end of the facade. The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers, this wasn't a moment for show. It was something deeper, a silent revolution captured in paperwork, not cries. Jasmine stood firm, her body still but her purpose transformed, not just vindicated but emboldened. Justice had moved forward, ignited by a woman they had tried to silence. She spoke again, not in triumph but to make sure no one else had to endure this fight. "I don't need him to lose his position," she declared, her voice slicing through the quiet. "I need a system where he can't use his power to protect wrongdoings." Those words felt like a second verdict, targeting the system itself. Reporters leaned in, and members of Congress listened closely, like missing a word would mean missing a pivotal moment in history. Jasmine laid down 3 sheets at the podium: simple but powerful proposals, an independent judicial ethics commission, mandatory public disclosure of gifts over $100, and full whistleblower protection. Everyone in the room understood, this was a pathway out of corruption. The chamber didn't explode with applause, it absorbed the gravity of the moment. Hands moved purposefully, aides and lawmakers scribbling notes, whispering, taking pictures of the proposals. No one protested. The silence didn't come from uncertainty, it held potential. Jasmine's words had jolted a traditionally bound system into clarity. She stepped back, giving a subtle nod to the young interns in the back, those who viewed the hearing as a matter of justice's future. Outside, the media swarm kicked into gear, headlines shifting in real time. Crockett reforms gain momentum. Inside, the moment hung in the air, a historic pause. An aide whispered, "It's already begun." Another replied, "No, she started it." Jasmine walked out steadily, not heralded as a victor, but carrying a momentum tied to principle. The world reacted, her confrontation with Kavanaugh viewed over 70 million times, a rupture echoing across political divides. Congress acted quickly, forming a special oversight committee to look into judicial vetting, passing with support from both sides. Change was afoot, law professors revamped their lectures, whistleblowers found their courage, and judicial reform became a personal fight, not a political one. Jasmine chose to step back from the limelight, turning down interview requests so she could concentrate on important legislation. Her essay in The Atlantic, titled "Justice Does Not Come from a Black Robe," made quite an impact, pushing Americans to rethink the idea of unchecked authority. She introduced the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act of 2025, which demands essential audits, ethical independence, and protections for whistleblowers. By nightfall, it had gathered a remarkable 92 co-sponsors, surprising many experts. Citizens started leaving notes on the steps of courthouses, echoing her words. One of her pointed questions, "Do you believe accepting yachts and cash is somehow more ethical?" was even projected onto building walls. Jasmine wasn't just looking for change, she was shining a light on the barriers that block it, illuminating a system that's been shrouded in darkness for too long. Back in Texas, Jasmine returned to her former high school, addressing students not as a hero but as someone who understands the heavy burden of truth. When someone asked if she felt scared facing Kavanaugh, she replied, "I wasn't standing in front of him. I was standing behind everyone silenced without a microphone." The room took a collective breath, her words cutting deep into the atmosphere. Later, her quote would find its way onto the walls of Columbia Law School, a full-circle moment in her journey. Jasmine didn't label herself as brave, she offered a model for others to follow, a guide for standing up against injustice. Her narrative wasn't one of victory, it was an invitation. What will you do with what you know? Justice kicks in when someone speaks the truth, not just shouts louder. Find your place, hold people accountable, support whistleblowers, believe survivors. Don't wait for anyone's go-ahead, your voice can be the spark that disrupts the cycle of injustice. Thanks for standing with us. Feel free to share your thoughts below and keep the conversation going about what's next.